Jacelyn O'Neill, and the title of my project is Fame Without the Fame, Performing and Negotiating Identity Among American Dwarf Wrestlers. This video will explore the ways that dwarf wrestlers establish and negotiate their identity. But first, let's establish what is already known about dwarfism. There are over 200 types of dwarfism, and it is defined as anyone 4 feet 10 inches or below whose stature involves a medical condition. There is still a lot of confusion around what terms are acceptable to call a person of short stature. The most favorable way to refer to a little person is simply by their name rather than a label, but when referring to this condition, preferred terms include dwarf, little person, or person of short stature. I will switch between all three interchangeably throughout the video. Even a quick Google search of dwarf reveals it is defined as a mythical creature or small star and fails to mention the more than 30,000 individuals in the U.S. living with the medical condition known as dwarfism. You can see that the discrepancy continues when looking at the image tab. Dwarf searches include cartoons of mythical creatures and very few images of people with dwarfism. This definition has mostly been formulated based on work within the Little People of America Association, or LPA. The LPA is a nonprofit organization dedicated to offering information and support on employment, education, disability rights, adoption, medical issues, clothing, adaptive products, and so much more to persons of short stature and their families. Every year, in a new city, the LPA hosts a national conference that gathers around 3,000 members and their families. These conferences remain important and continue to grow because of the cultural intimacy experienced by members, an intimacy I was fortunate enough to experience with my family growing up. In my view, the LPA community is fiercely loyal to each other and is bonded by the distinct experiences associated with being a little person. However, in all 12 years that I have attended the LPA, I have never met a self-identifying dwarf wrestler. This is largely due to the LPA's negative stance on dwarf wrestling. In the LPA's key messages, they state that the choice wrestlers make doesn't only impact them. It impacts thousands of other little people and their families who are forced to address the stigma related to dwarfs being used as entertainment because of their stature. And they define dwarf wrestling as marketing little people as an entertainment spectacle, just as little people were put on display based on their physical differences during the days of the traditional sideshow and freak show. I have talked extensively with many other LPA members and have learned that these values extend to many members as well. I have learned that dwarf wrestlers are ostracized and unwelcome at LPA chapter meetings and national conventions. Not only are dwarf wrestlers unwelcome, they have never been previously studied. This creates a huge gap in understanding. My current project was formulated in light of this contrast between the philosophy of acceptance, inclusion, and community building of LPA conventions and the contemporaneous denial and ostracization of dwarf wrestlers, as well as the lack of ethnographic work that has been done. The diversity which exists in the little people community and the multifaceted experience that dwarves have cannot be adequately summed up in a cohesive definition or even a cohesive experience and needs to be explored. To explore the questions I had about the ways dwarf wrestlers come to understand dwarfism, I interviewed 5 dwarf wrestlers and analyzed YouTube videos for themes and narratives during performances. I had intended to conduct interviews in person and attend live shows. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, my project quickly transitioned to a virtual one. During the summer of 2020, I used person-centered interviewing techniques which require meeting with participants multiple times to explore what is at stake for the respondent in his or her daily life from their point of view. With this established, I met with each wrestler a minimum of 5 times via Zoom. I interviewed 5 men ages 23 to 55 of various races, backgrounds, and dwarfisms. Topics included wrestlers' opinions, experiences, and understandings of being a dwarf wrestler, performances, and more generally, experiences as a dwarf. During the interviews, wrestlers and I watched them together to discuss what performance has meant to them and to deepen my understanding of the shows. I found that dwarf wrestlers strategically deploy and redeploy their memberships to certain parts of their intersectional identities under different social conditions. For example, in this video, Jesse, who is Chinese American, dressed as Donald Trump to promote a red versus blue match 2 weeks before the 2020 presidential election. In this example, Jesse explains that the goal of performing his racial and national identities simultaneously, Chinese and American, is to promote the show with shock value.
You see an Asian dwarf dressed up like Trump, of course it gets your attention.
God bless America. It's gonna be huge.
Jesse explains that his goal was to confuse the viewer as to where his political alliances lie, by dressing as an arch-conservative figure and a white one as well, but being Asian and labeled disabled, he feels that the total political outcome of his performance is nullified, Essentially, the two performances of identity cancel each other out and only equal spectacle. Jesse bucks his ascribed identity in two ways. First, he refuses to allow viewers to politically pigeonhole him because of his race by twisting political messaging. And second, his act of performing athletically as a dwarf wrestler demonstrates his ability in the face of perceived limitations. Dwarf wrestlers not only acknowledge they have interpersonal identities beyond being a dwarf, but that they are able to negotiate between their identities to manipulate audience reception. Even though the LPA believes that dwarf wrestling shows are exploitative, the wrestlers believe they are able to reclaim space in the ring and highlight their agency and ability. In popular media depictions, little people perform and are represented as caricatures for comic relief, such as Mini-Me in the Austin Powers movies, or The Wizard of Oz, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Thus, when audiences attend a dwarf wrestling show, they often do so to gawk at the dwarf body. Wrestlers are able to implement tactics of intersubjectivity and take the assumption that many place on them and challenge that assumption by performing physically and demonstrating athleticism. Athletes categorized as disabled are able to contrast with stereotypes of disability and disrupt stigma. For example, after watching a dwarf wrestling show, one viewer on a YouTube video commented, "I'm actually super impressed at the athleticism of these wrestlers. Came for a laugh, but left truly amazed. So much respect for their dedication in the show they put on." Oftentimes, the social aspects of being a little person are more disabling than their physical size. Wrestlers use their onstage performances to challenge stereotypes about the limitations of their bodies and instead display their ability.
And because I felt some of that thing before, the real thing that's different is when people ask me questions now, it's not because of my height. Like, it's because I'm, but I think I favor the fame questions better.
Yeah.
Because it's more talking about my work. And I feel like, I don't have to be reminded I'm a little person all the time.
Here, Antoine uses fame to denote the embodied experience of living with dwarfism. Notions about dwarfism are so ingrained that staring, harassment, and photographic exploitation of little people are common. He emphasized the similarities between the experiences of living as a little person and those of someone who is famous. Antoine has artfully crafted his shortstop identity, creating novel self-narratives to reshape how others come to see him. The most interesting thing that I learned was that many of the dwarf wrestlers had not known they were little people until early adulthood, and many had never received a formal diagnosis. For example, Antoine shared with me the time that he self-diagnosed his dwarfism.
And that's I found it on accident. One day I watched Leprechaun. When I watched it, my nephew made a joke. He was like, well, he ran up, he was like, yeah, he did kind of run like me. And I actually looked at Walt Davis and I said, he kind of do his features like mine.
Oftentimes, people assume that more education about a topic is synonymous with being more politically correct or doing the right thing. However, through the interviews with dwarf wrestlers and LPA members, I learned that the less access to medicalization and information about dwarfism, the less disabled dwarfs felt in their bodies. And the more information little people had about their dwarfism and the more medicalization their condition received, the more they internalized disability and felt disabled in their bodies. This entirely shapes the ways that dwarf wrestlers and LPA members come to understand dwarfism. Dwarf wrestlers ask, well, if I'm like everyone else, just perhaps shorter, then why would choosing to be a wrestler be any different? But because the LPA comes from a higher class background and are associated with more power in the community, they shape what becomes right and wrong. Dwarf wrestlers and little people in general are a heterogeneous mixture of experiences, understandings, and individuals. Rather than try to homogenize minority groups, I hope that this research sheds light on why it is so important not to create a monolith of experience for minority groups. The world is not black and white, and we shouldn't treat it as such. We should strive for accepting individuals and appreciating what makes them unique. I am so very honored to have been given the opportunity to conduct this research. Thank you to everyone who made this possible.